Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the Viking Berserker, the legendary Norse warrior who charged into battle shirtless, possibly high, and definitely angry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. It's a boy, a loud one. You didn't so much enter the world as blast into it, fists clenched, face red, and lungs at full capacity. The midwife says you howled for 7 uninterrupted minutes, which he claims is a local record. The village priest tried to bless you, but you bit his finger twice. From the start, you're not like other Viking babies. They coop, you growl. They nap. You glare at the thatched roof like it owes you silver. The family goat refuses to enter the longhouse when you're crying, which is most of the time. By the time you're crawling, you're already a menace. You've headbutted a hearthstone, bitten a sheep, and tried to fight your own shadow. Your parents are both alarmed and oddly proud. Your mother starts calling you a bear cub, while your father quietly tells the neighbors you'll probably grow out of it. He says this while bandaging his shin. When other children play with carved wooden animals, you break yours in half and pretend it's a weapon. You practice screaming at trees. You once challenged a rock to a duel. You lost, but only because your cousin tackled you mid-roar and had to be removed from your back with a wooden spoon. As you grow, so does your reputation. Older villagers mutter things like spirited or cursed. You're not allowed near the beer barrel anymore after that one incident where you accidentally or intentionally bit the handle off. You're 4. The village shaman insists you have the fire in your blood. Your grandmother says it's just worms. Either way, everyone agrees you're headed down a particular path, and that path is likely to include yelling, battle, and an impressive collection of scars by age 12. But you're happy, sort of. You don't really smile, but you do laugh when thunder strikes, and you've started carrying around a stick you call the enemy. You talk to it sometimes. It doesn't respond. Yet, in a cold land full of quiet survivalists and stoic fishermen, you stand out a small, shirtless whirlwind of unpredictable fury and potential. You are not built for farming. You are not built for peace. You are built for berserking, and the village knows it. Your childhood, if we can even call it that, is less about innocence and more about collateral damage. Most Viking children learn practical skills early. Rope knotting, fire building, and not stepping on livestock. You, however, specialize in accidental chaos. You break your first wooden sword within an hour of receiving it, not from training but from swinging it into a support beam during breakfast. The house wobbles. Your father just sighed. You've been banned from the chicken pen repeatedly. It started as curiosity. Then you tried to train them. Then you challenged the rooster to single combat. The rooster won. You declared a rematch. No one knows what happened to it after that, but you walk around with a single feather braided into your hair and call it victory. At age 6, you fashion your own shield out of a broken barrel lid and charge into the family's drying racks. Clothes fly. Your mother calls you a storm in human form. Your grandmother tells people you're possessed by a warrior spirit. You tell people you just wanted to see what would break first, you or the pole. It was the pole. You are not malicious, just energetic. Your intentions are never cruel, just loud and fast. If something stands, you push it. If something cracks, you hit it. If something moves, you chase it. The village quickly learns to adjust. Neighbors begin reinforcing their fences. Local boys play father from your house. Girls point at you and whisper. One brave child calls you brainwashed. You tackle him into a snowdrift and gain a nickname, Snowbreaker. You wear it proudly. Your only true friend is a sheepdog named Thorik, who follows you everywhere and occasionally saves you from your own decisions. Like the time you tried to scale the fish drying scaffolds for training. You fell. The fish broke your fall. You still smell like haddock when it rains. Occasionally, an elder suggests you be sent to the temple for spiritual guidance. The temple politely declines. So you remain a child of noise and splinters, always half covered in mud and stories. No one teaches you restraint. No one dares. Because even at age 7, it's clear you're not going to grow into a Viking farmer. You're going to grow into a Viking problem. By the time you turn 8, the village has stopped asking, "What's wrong with him?" and begun asking, "How do we point him at our enemies?" There's something in the way you glare at thunderstorms like you're trying to win a staring contest with the sky. Something in how you don't just run. You charge through puddles, through fences, through things that weren't built to be charged through. Your appetite is the stuff of legend. You eat like you're preparing for winter, even in summer. At one feast, you accidentally ate 3 boiled eggs, 2 fish cakes, and part of a table centerpiece before anyone noticed. When they did, you were already gnawing on a ladle. Your body is a road map of bruises and splinters, and none of them seems to slow you down. The local healer gave up trying to keep up with your injuries and now just gives you a reassuring pat on the back and says, "Try to aim for the soft parts next time." You've begun developing a laugh, not a joyful one, but a full-chested, "I just scared myself and liked it" kind of noise. You once laughed this way after falling off a roof. You broke a barrel, a crate of onions, and part of your arm. You insisted it was the best day of your life. You start carrying sticks the size of small oars and calling them battle staves. You give them names like Skull Tickler and Stick of Pain. You duel trees. Some trees lose. Your parents have given up assigning chores. Every attempt at teaching you patience ends in something getting set on fire. Once it was a bench. Once it was your own tunic. You don't wear that style anymore. The village elders begin to talk, not in hushed tones, but in whispers thick with awe and concern. They say you might be Berserker-born, touched by Odin, or possibly just cursed by too much goat milk. Either way, you are no longer just a rambunctious child. You are something more, something untrainable, something unshakable, something that scares wolves and makes birds fly away when you walk past. You are becoming the very thing Norse mothers warn their children about, and your journey hasn't even properly started yet. At age 10, someone finally decides you should receive formal training. It's unclear who, since no one wants to actually be your trainer. Eventually, a one-eyed veteran named Gore the Limp volunteers, mostly out of boredom or possibly revenge. Gore's idea of training is standing 20 feet away and shouting things like, "Swing harder and less teeth, more axe," while you flail wildly at straw dummies, tree trunks, and the occasional chicken that wanders too close. He doesn't correct your form, mostly because you don't have any. What you have is momentum and the blind confidence of a boy who once tried to arm wrestle a weathered oak. Weapon options are limited. You are handed a practice axe, so dull it could legally be called a spoon. You sharpen it against a rock. The rock loses. The next day, Gore gives you a heavier one. You say thank you by swinging it mid-con conversation and knocking his drinking horn into a nearby fire. He nods. You'll go far. Other children train with discipline and precision. You train by charging at hay bales and screaming at birds. You aren't so much learning swordplay as developing a deeply personal relationship with chaos. You're also introduced to wrestling, a Norse staple. The first match ends with you suplexing a boy named Egil into a puddle so hard he develops a stutter. You help him up afterward and ask if he wants to be friends. He politely declines and moves to another village. There's no written curriculum, but it's clear you're being groomed for something special. People start referring to you not as a boy, but as a project. Gore says he hasn't seen such raw, unfocused rage, since that time he headbutted a monk during a raid, and the monk won. The only structured lesson you enjoy is battle chants. Not for the rhythm, just because shouting in unison with other boys gives you a socially acceptable way to yell without being told to go outside again. You don't master footwork or timing or balance. What you master is unpredictability. The kind of unpredictability that makes grown warriors instinctively step to the side when you come running. Because your training, while unconventional, is working. And the next step is frenzy and full-on berserking. At age 12, your reputation has grown larger than your actual body. You're known across 3 villages as that loud boy who headbutts things. And one farmer insists you made his scarecrow retire. It's time for a rite of passage, the bear skin ceremony, where you're officially inducted into the Berserker fold. No one explains what the ceremony will involve. One morning, Gore the Limp simply grunts, hands you a bucket of goat blood, and says, "You'll need this." This does not calm you, but you're excited. In a mildly unhinged, foaming at the mouth sort of way, you are brought deep into the forest, where 5 large men stand in a circle around a fire. All of them are either shirtless, scarred, or muttering to themselves. One is all 3. They nod at you in that very Viking way, emotionless but somehow threatening. The first part of the ceremony involves painting runes on your chest with the goat's blood. The symbols likely mean courage, strength, or possibly, "Please don't bite me." You try not to ask questions. You also try not to sneeze. Then comes the bear skin. It is enormous, smells like it fought its own funeral, and is draped over your shoulders like a heavy, hairy prophecy. It's unclear if the bear was killed in honorable combat or just dropped dead from smelling you. Either way, it fits. As the fire crackles and the older berserkers chant in deep, unintelligible tones, probably Norse, possibly just grunting, you are handed a horn of something vaguely alcoholic, definitely spicy, and absolutely suspicious. You drink it in one go. This is a mistake. Your eyebrows briefly try to exit your face. Now you dance. Not gracefully. Not well. Just violently, like a thunderstorm having a tantrum. You stomp, howl, and wave your arms like someone being chased by bees. This is called becoming the bear. You are encouraged not to fall into the fire. You are also not forbidden from doing so. When the ceremony ends, you are given your new name. It might be Wolf Liver or Ulfa Scream, or that kid. You're too dizzy to hear clearly, but it doesn't matter. You are now officially a berserker in training. Your enemies should start worrying, because you've been given the fur. And now you're learning to growl. Now that you're a junior berserker with bare skin that smells like wet thunder, it's time to learn one of the oldest, most sacred parts of berserker culture. Pre-battle rituals, which mostly involve mushrooms. Not the kind you eat with stew. The kind you eat if you want to question reality and roar at clouds. No one explains exactly what these mushrooms do. They just hand you a fistful and say, "Chew fast." You chew fast. They taste like moss, goat sweat, and shame. Within minutes, your vision begins to vibrate, and the fire starts speaking in riddles. Someone burps near you, and it sounds like a war horn. You are ready. You are now introduced to what the elders call a berserker trance. The goal is to tap into your inner beast. Yours appears to be a confused elk with boundary issues. You don't care. You're grinning and growling, and your muscles feel like they're full of molten iron and reckless decisions. A training dummy is brought out. You don't wait for instructions. You charge, tackle it, and bite its neck. The elders are impressed. The dummy is less so. One of the older berserkers simply says, "Yep, he's got it." The mushrooms also come with drawbacks. Time starts to bend. You're not sure if you've been screaming for 10 seconds or 3 hours. You try to punch a shadow. It ducks. You accuse the ground of betrayal. Eventually, you tire yourself out mid-sprint and fall face-first into a barrel of fish. The fish are fine. You smell like sadness and seawater for a week. Despite this, the ritual is considered a success. Not every berserker uses mushrooms. Some fast, some meditate, and others just rely on extreme amounts of rage and unresolved trauma. You, however, seem to thrive on the hallucinogenic option. You call it brain lightning. No one corrects you. The goal is simple: to become something more than human. Fewer men, more storms. The kind of force that terrifies enemies before your axe even lands. The kind of warrior who doesn't retreat. Not because of courage, but because you forgot how directions work mid-frenzy. And that's what makes you special. Dangerous, and honestly kind of hard to babysit. You're no longer just learning to fight. You're learning how to unleash the storm. It's finally time. No more practice. No more straw dummies. No more politely biting logs. You're about to enter your first real fight. And with it, your first full-blown berserk gang. That's the technical term for complete, glorious, screaming madness. You wake up on battle day with one clear thought. Violence sounds good today. You don't eat breakfast, not because you're fasting, but because you accidentally crushed your meal with excitement. You do, however, accept the ritual mushroom snack. At this point, your stomach considers it a food group. Then comes the pre-battle dance, which is less dance and more collective shouting. While hopping in place, you swing your axe until someone reminds you that comrades are not the enemy. You grunt an apology and headbutt a helmet instead. This is considered progress. As the enemy approaches, the world begins to tunnel. You're vaguely aware of screaming. It might be yours. You grip your axe so tightly it cacks. Your eyes roll back just slightly. Enough to worry everyone but impress Gore, who whispers he's ready. And then frenzy. You charge, not walk, not jog, but charge. Your legs forget coordination and switch to pure instinct. You leap, roar, flail, and swing with the grace of a walrus on fire, but the efficiency of a tornado with a grudge. Pain means nothing. You're grazed by an arrow and respond by biting a tree. The spear nearly gets you, and you high-kick its owner in the knee and keep moving. You tackle two men, and don't stop until you forget who they were. You are every Viking's nightmare come true. This is the Berserk Gang, a state where the body operates on rage, adrenaline, and very poor impulse control. Some call it divine possession. Others call it psychological dissociation. You call it Tuesday. You scream until your throat is hoarse. You fight until your arms go numb. You are unreachable. Not even your comrades try talking to you. One gently pats you on the back with his shield to signal, "We're done now." You throw a log at him. He takes it as a compliment. When the dust settles, the battle is over. You're standing, barely, covered in blood, bruises, and bits of someone's helmet. No one says anything. They just stare. You blink twice and mutter, "Good warm-up." You are now officially a berserker. You may have noticed something during your first few battles, namely the distinct lack of anything remotely resembling armor. While other warriors suit up in mail, helmets, and strategically placed bits of boiled leather, you walk onto the battlefield dressed in fur, spit, and optimism. If you're feeling fancy, maybe you wrap a leather strap around your wrist. For fashion, not protection. Berserkers don't wear armor. Why? Because armor is for people who plan to get hit. Your strategy involves not getting hit by terrifying your enemies into running away or screaming themselves into submission. If someone actually lands a blow, that's a personal failure, and you will remember it forever and bring it up passively-aggressively at every feast. There's also the matter of freedom of movement. Armor is heavy. It clings. It restricts your ability to flail wildly. And Berserker combat is 80% flailing, 10% biting, and 10% rolling through bushes on fire. You can't do that in a helmet. Your bear skin cloak, however, is sacred. It smells like burnt ham and regret, but it matters. Some say it holds magical powers like absorbing enemy fear or warding off steel. Mostly, it just absorbs rain and makes you look like a very angry rug. But that's the point. You're not supposed to look human. You're supposed to look like something that escaped a saga and now haunts the coastline. The lack of armor also means your body becomes the armor. You build calluses where others build shields. Your scars tell stories. Your bruises form constellations. And if you're really committed, you tattoo a wolf on your chest using ash, a sharp stick, and poor decisions. Sure, sometimes it hurts. Arrows sting, blades leave marks, but pain to a berserker is just a helpful reminder that you're not dead yet. You once got stabbed in the leg and didn't notice until someone pointed out you were leaking. You thanked them and then threw a rock at the guy who stabbed you. Other warriors may scoff at your lack of defense until they see you take down 3 men with a wooden spoon and a scream. Then they start scoffing from a distance because armor is overrated. You've got rage, fur, and absolutely no fear of consequences. So, here's a little-known truth about going berserk. Once the blood haze sets in, everything looks like an enemy. You might have the best intentions. You might even go into battle thinking, "Today I will only maim the correct people." But then the screaming starts. The mushrooms kick in. And suddenly, your own warband starts looking suspiciously stab-worthy. Your first incident is minor. You headbutt your shield brother while trying to high-five him with your axe. He takes it in stride. Part of the experience, he grunts while applying moss to the wound, but it escalates quickly. In your third raid, you mistake a fellow Viking's braided beard for a snake and try to punch it off his face. Later, during a melee, you throw your helmet at someone, shouting your name. It was your cousin. He was trying to tell you dinner was ready. No one holds a grudge, though, because you're a berserker, and berserkers are like extremely violent puppies. Messy, unpredictable, and not totally aware of how hard they're biting. You even apologize once mid-frenzy after slamming into someone's back. It comes out as a roar and a thumbs up. He nods respectfully from the ground. The warband begins developing tactics to survive around you. Some wear bright red sashes, so you remember not to tackle them. You forget anyway. Others stay 10 foot behind you and let you clear a path. One clever warrior starts shouting your name mid-fight, just to confuse you. It works. You chase a tree for 20 minutes. Occasionally, someone suggests putting a bell around your neck. They are ignored. You are not a goat. You just act like one. By now, your comrades have developed a system. If you charge in the wrong direction, they wait. If you roar at a tent, they know to give you 5 minutes and then quietly set it on fire afterward, so you feel accomplished. Despite the accidental injuries, no one wants to fight without you. Because sure, you might swing wildly, hit allies, and bite a few ankles, but you also break enemy morale just by existing. You are a storm, and sometimes storms hit friendly boats, but there's still storms. By now, your name carries weight. Not respect, exactly. More like a vague sense of unease. In neighboring villages, you're known as that one with the twitch or the boy who ate a shield. No one's quite sure if that last story is true, but you don't correct them. Because in the berserker business, myth is more useful than memory. Word spreads faster than you do. Before you even arrive, people hide their goats and reinforce their fences. Children whisper your name during storms. Some adults do too, especially the ones who still remember that time you mistook a feast for a fight and flipped 3 tables before someone handed you a leg of lamb and gently redirected you toward the food. In battle, enemies hesitate when they see you. Not because you're tall or fancy. You're not. You're usually barefoot, shirtless, and bleeding from somewhere. But your eyes say, I don't know who you are and I don't care. I just need something to scream at. This psychological warfare is your greatest weapon. You don't have polished armor or fancy technique. You have a reputation, and that's far scarier. But reputation comes with a price. Damage control. After every battle, the cleanup begins. You usually wake up with a headache, covered in someone else's blood, clutching a tree branch you've named Victory. A priest offers a prayer. You grunt. He backs away. You've accidentally broken 3 long ships. Twice by stepping on them. Scared off a diplomat by growling during a council meeting. And once tried to wrestle a statue. You lost, but only technically. Your warband learns to assign a handler, someone to calm you post-battle, guide you away from anything flammable, and remind you that tents are not enemies. You nod, then punch the ground. Old habits. Despite this, your legend grows. Scolds sing songs about you, mostly in minor keys. One refers to you as the Howling Hammer of Nordfield. You like it. You don't remember Nordfield, but assume it's something you broke. You're not just a warrior anymore. You're a walking rumor, a moving cautionary tale with strong shoulders and no impulse control. And in this brutal world of axes and honor, that makes you valuable, or at least entertaining. You never planned on falling in love. Most berserkers don't. Feelings are tricky, hard to swing an axe at, and generally uncooperative. But one day, in between raids and headbutts, it happens. She's a blacksmith's daughter. Strong forearms, suspicious eyes, and a tendency to hit things with tongs when annoyed. You find this attractive. She finds you interesting, which is a generous term for dangerous, but occasionally funny. Your courtship begins the traditional Viking way by accidentally breaking her father's anvil. You try to test its strength by hitting it with a log. She storms out, furious, only to stop when you, with absolute sincerity, offer to fight the anvil's ghost. She laughs a little, then throws a horseshoe at you. Love. You try to impress her with your skills. You flex. You throw a rock very far. You lift a goat. She watches politely and continues hammering. Eventually, she agrees to go for a walk, mostly because it's safer to supervise you than to leave you unattended. The conversation is awkward. You don't know how to flirt, but you're really good at screaming and carrying things, so you carry a log the entire time. She doesn't comment on it. That's how you know she might be the one. Your fellow berserkers are confused. Isn't love a distraction? One asks. You explain that she gives you a reason not to destroy every tent you see. That sounds like discipline, he mutters. You don't respond. You're already carving her name into your bare skin with a stick. Eventually, she gives you a necklace. Simple metal, slightly sharp. You don't take it off ever, even in battle. Especially in battle. When asked why, you say, "It protects me," which is sweet and slightly alarming. You still don't understand emotions, but you understand loyalty. She fixes your gear. You bring her interesting bones. It's working. There are arguments, of course. You once tried to serenade her by howling at the moon. She asked you to stop. You howled louder. You slept outside for 3 nights. Still, she doesn't leave. And that, in Berserker terms, is a proposal. You may be a force of chaos, but even storms enjoy a little lightning romance. After battle comes feasting, the Viking reward system for not dying, food, drink, singing, and belching contests. For most warriors, it's a celebration. For you, it's a minefield of too much energy and not enough self-control. You always arrive late because someone has to scrape the blood off you first. You enter shirtless, bruised, possibly missing a sandal, and carrying something that may or may not be edible. Once you brought a squirrel, no one ate it. It still shows up in your schooled songs, though. The feast begins with a toast, which you interpret as a signal to drink everything within reach. Mead, ale, or something that smells like fermented regret. You once drank lamp oil by accident. No one stopped you. You lit a torch with your breath that night. The children still talk about it. Then comes food. Bread, roasted meats, pickled everything. You approach the table like it owed you money. You don't choose so much as negotiate with your food using your face. Once you ate 5 boiled eggs in 1 minute and declared war on a cabbage. Your digestive system, however, has not caught up to your ambitions. This leads to the Great Hall Incident, a night of heavy beans, loud singing, and a strategically timed battle chant that ends with a kind of noise that echoes off stone walls. You pretend nothing happened. Everyone else pretends not to have heard it. One man weeps softly into his porridge. Then there's the fighting because, of course, a room full of sleep-deprived warriors with weapons and me is the perfect setting for emotional growth. You once started a brawl by mishearing someone say "pass the boar" as you smell like boar. You took it personally. The benches never recovered. Despite the chaos, you're always forgiven.
Why?
Because you entertain. You fight with passion. You eat with conviction. And your flatulence once scared a wolf away from the village. That's considered a contribution. By the end of the night, you're asleep under a table, clutching a ham bone and humming a war song to yourself. Because berserkers don't just rage in battle. They party like the apocalypse, too. Every great berserker has one story they don't talk about. Yours is known simply as the sheep incident. It starts like any other raid. A long ship, a coastal village, and the smell of overconfidence. You're pumped. You've had your mushrooms. You're wearing your battle bear skin backwards for intimidation reasons. No one corrects you. No one wants to die today. The plan is simple. Raid a small settlement. Take some silver. Break a few fences for fun. You arrive. The village is empty. Suspiciously empty. No guards. No screaming.
Just a lot of sheep.
Most warriors would pause. You charge. You leap off the ship, howling, and sprint straight into the first woolly blur. You see, it's a sheep. It does not fight back. You take this as submission and declare victory. The others follow, mostly out of confusion. You begin attacking structures with unrestrained enthusiasm. One of them turns out to be a chicken coop. You are pecked aggressively by 5 hens and a rooster named Olaf. You retaliate by headbutting the sky. It's unclear who wins. You eventually enter what looks like a sacred hut and knock over an altar. Turns out it was someone's kitchen. You eat 2 loaves of bread and a candle. You only realize it was a candle when it starts burning your throat. You growl. The candle regrets everything. It becomes obvious this wasn't a village. It was someone's summer pasture. A farmer shows up alone, elderly, carrying a rake and a look of mild irritation. You scream. He squints. You charge. He throws a turnip at your head. You retreat. This becomes the official end of the raid. Back at camp, no one says anything. One warrior softly mutters, "We stole a goat." You nod solemnly. Another adds, "And we burned a cabbage patch." You say, "It looked threatening." The scolds try to spin it into a tale of courage. They fail. You're remembered as the berserker who conquered a flock and lost to root vegetables. You try to defend yourself. "The sheep were looking at me funny." You insist. They nod. They've heard worse. And yet your legend still grows. Because sometimes what makes a berserker memorable isn't just victory, it's volume. You're older now. Not wise exactly, but the kind of older where your knees crack when you crouch and people no longer flinch when you raise your axe because they know it takes a full minute to swing. Your beard is graying. Your scars are doubling as weather predictors. You've begun telling war stories to anyone within earshot. Children, travelers, and livestock. You once told a barrel for 3 hours before realizing it wasn't listening. Didn't matter. It was still a great story. You've achieved something few berserkers do. Survival. Most of your kind burn out early. Too much rage, too many mushrooms, not enough ducking. But you've dodged death by sheer unpredictability. Even the gods don't know what you'll do next. Your name is spoken with respect, or at least volume. Some say you're half bear, half wolf, and half madman. No one does the math. They just nod. You've trained a few young warriors and tried to pass on the berserker craft. You taught one to roar from his stomach. You taught another how to tackle a tree without apology. You even taught a third how to scream, "I am the wind," mid-fight. He now runs a bakery but still screams it during dough kneading. You don't raid as much anymore. Your last attempt ended in you getting stuck in a doorway and blaming the architecture. Instead, you guard the village, stand by fires, and grumble like a particularly irritable mountain. Occasionally, someone brings you a mushroom. You sniff it and mutter, "Not today, hallucinations." Your companion, the blacksmith's daughter, still puts up with you. She rolls her eyes when you growl at thunder. You roll yours when she tells you to wash your cloak. Neither of you listens. That's love. And so your legacy becomes not just war, but presence. Children play berserk by throwing sticks and yelling. Elders mutter, "You remind me of him." Whenever someone kicks over a bench, your legend is no longer just about chaos. It's about survival, laughter, and very poor table manners. You may not live forever, but your stories will, loudly, inaccurately, and probably involving sheep. No one lives forever, not even you, the roaring, flailing, mushroom-fueled nightmare of the North. One winter, your bones start arguing with the cold. You grunt more than you speak. The fire becomes your favorite weapon. You sit beside it, muttering to yourself and polishing your axe with a bit of beard you accidentally tore out, sneezing. You don't fear death. You've shouted at it too many times. You once tried to wrestle a thunderstorm just to make the afterlife jealous. If anything, you're annoyed it's taking so long. You keep saying things like, "Any day now," followed by dramatic coughing and chewing rocks for effect. Eventually, it comes, not in battle, not during a raid, but peacefully under the stars, wrapped in your old bear skin, which still smells like regret and goat. You simply sit back, sigh, and mutter. Tell Valhalla to reinforce the chairs. They say the skies thundered that night. They say a wolf howled without reason. They say someone found your final words carved into a shield. I regret nothing except that turnip. Your funeral is predictably a mess. The village tries to hold a dignified ceremony. Instead, half the mourners end up brawling after someone says you once punched a cloud. A goat gets loose. The peak catches fire too early. You would have been proud. Your warband drinks heavily. They sing songs off-key. They toss your old helmet into the fjord. It immediately sinks like you once did, drunk during a swimming contest with a barrel. Children reenact your life with sticks, grunts, and the occasional backflip. One of them bites a log. Everyone agrees. Your spirit lives on. The scolds write ballads. None of the details are accurate. You're credited with slaying 20 men in one swing and seducing a forest spirit. No one corrects them. History prefers entertainment over truth. Anyway, you're gone, yes, but never forgotten because you weren't just a warrior. You were a walking storm in human form, equal parts chaos and comedy. And long after the fire dies, your roar still echoes through tales, scars, and poorly reinforced tavern walls. When you picture a Viking, your brain probably jumps to the usual cliches. blood-soaked axes, snarling beards, and maybe a little too much BO. But here's the twist. Those battle-hardened Norsemen were surprisingly obsessed with their appearance. Behind the myths of savagery, there was a culture that valued grooming, cleanliness, and a well-put-together look. That's right. Your average Viking might have been cleaner than you on a lazy Sunday. Archaeologists digging up Viking graves and settlements didn't just find swords and drinking horns. They found tweezers, razors, ear spoons, and combs. Lots and lots of combs. Not cheap ones either. These were carefully carved from bone or antler, sometimes inlaid with delicate decorations. We're not talking about utilitarian tooth scratches. These were works of art, status symbols tucked into belts or hidden in pouches like Viking Gucci. And they didn't stop at combs. Men and women alike owned grooming kits, often stored with the same care as weapons. That wasn't by accident. To the Vikings, personal cleanliness wasn't just hygiene. It was an honor. Looking sharp meant you had self-respect. And in a society where reputation was everything, you didn't show up to a feast or a thing, their version of a town hall meeting, looking like a soggy hay bale. In fact, the line between warrior and peacock got pretty blurry. Oiled beards, braided hair, colorful tunics. These weren't side hobbies. They were statements. A well-groomed man said, "I may have just sailed for 3 days straight and decapitated a few monks, but look at this beard. Pristine." Even slaves and lower status folks had access to grooming tools.
Why?
Unlike some later medieval societies, the Vikings didn't associate filth with piety or humility. Cleanliness wasn't sinful. It was sexy. If you wanted to impress a potential bride or make a power play at court, you started with a clean face and neatly combed hair. First impressions mattered. Just ask any Viking woman. Most sagas describe beauty in terms of bright eyes, shining hair, and spotless skin, not battle scars. So no, the Vikings weren't dirty brutes. They were high-maintenance, fashion-forward warriors who didn't just conquer with blades, but also with style. While the rest of medieval Europe was still debating whether water was a tool of the devil or a possible source of disease, the Vikings were scrubbing themselves down like it was a national sport. Cleanliness wasn't just an occasional act. It was routine. So much so that they literally named a day after it. Lugardeiger, or Bath Day, eventually gave us the word Saturday. Yes, your lazy Netflix and shower day has Viking roots. Now, bathing for the Vikings wasn't just about washing off battlefield gunk or fishing grime. It was social, spiritual, and sometimes even romantic. Families would heat water over a fire and pour it into wooden tubs. If you were wealthier, you might have your own dedicated bathhouse. If you were poor, you'd settle for a nearby stream. Either way, you were getting clean. No excuses.
Soap.
Oh, they had it. Made from animal fat and ash, Viking soap was tough stuff. Gritty, alkaline, and shockingly effective. It wasn't lavender-scented or gently exfoliating, but it got the job done. Some formulas were even strong enough to bleach hair, which, conveniently, many Viking men did. A blonde beard wasn't just a genetic blessing. It could also be a fashion choice. That's right. Ancient Norsemen were literally bleaching their beards centuries before punk rockers thought it was edgy. But here's where it gets really fun. Their enemies hated this about them. English monks and chroniclers couldn't stand how clean the Norsemen were. They'd complain that the Vikings washed their faces every day, combed their hair regularly, and even changed their clothes.
Scandalous, right?
One 11th century chronicler even blamed Viking grooming habits for their success with Anglo-Saxon women. According to him, English women were completely dazzled by how fresh and fashionable their invaders looked. Not a great look for the local guys. And let's be clear, bathing wasn't just for men. Viking women were equally meticulous. Their hygiene routines likely included hair oils, skin care made from herbs or animal fats, and yes, their own sets of grooming tools. Cleanliness was communal. You bathed, you socialized, and maybe you caught the eye of that cute shield maiden across the stream. If you imagined Viking clothing as nothing more than ragged pelts held together by fish guts and poor decisions, think again. The Vikings had style, and not just for function but for flair. These weren't cave-dwelling savages who threw on whatever animal died closest. They carefully crafted their outfits with color, embroidery, and layers. Lots of layers. If you walked into a Viking longhouse wearing drab beige, someone might hand you a comb and ask if everything was all right at home. Let's start with the basics. Viking men typically wore a linen or woolen tunic that extended to the thighs, paired with trousers or leggings. But it didn't stop there. Belts were a fashion staple, not just to hold things up but to show off wealth. A richly adorned belt buckle could scream, "I'm important," just as loudly as a sword. Cloaks were common, too, fastened with decorative brooches, often shaped like animals, dragons, or symbols from Norse mythology. Practical, sure, but also an early form of Viking flexing. Now, the women weren't just wrapped in potato sacks, either. Viking women's fashion was equally distinct. They typically wore a long underdress with a shorter overdress held up by a pair of oval brooches at the shoulders. Hanging between the brooches, beads, charms, maybe even tiny scissors or keys. It was part utility, part jewelry, and part power statement. Want to know who runs the household? Look for the woman with the most jangly accessories. And color? Oh yes, they loved color. Vikings dyed their clothing using natural pigments. Yellows from birch leaves, reds from madderroot, and blues from woad. While rich, deep hues were reserved for the wealthy, even average folks sported at least some color. A pop of blue or red on your tunic might signal good taste, or just that your wife had access to decent dye. Footwear, usually leather shoes or boots tied with toggles or laces. They were practical, often replaced, and not particularly flashy, unless, of course, you were rich, in which case you might decorate them or have them specially made. Vikings didn't just wear their culture. They wore it on their heads. From intricately braided locks to perfectly shaped beards, hair was a statement of strength, identity, and yes, sex appeal. Forget the shaggy, unkempt manis you see in gritty TV dramas. Real Vikings treated their hair like armor for the face, carefully crafted and worn with pride. Let's start with the beard, a sacred canvas for the Norsemen. Short, long, forked, braided, or squared off, a Viking's beard was his signature. It wasn't just about growing one. It was about sculpting it. Beard oil, likely made from rendered animal fat mixed with herbs, kept things soft and shiny. And if your beard looked like a goat chewed on it, well, don't expect many feasting invites. But it wasn't just the men. Women also took immense pride in their hair. Typically, they wore it long and parted down the center, often braided or coiled up into intricate styles. For festivals and rituals, they might adorn their hair with ribbons, beads, or even bits of metal. These weren't purely decorative. They signaled status, family ties, and sometimes even availability. Yes, Viking hair could flirt before you even said a word. And braiding. Oh, they loved a good braid. For both genders, braids served practical and aesthetic purposes. They kept their hair tidy during farming, sailing, or raiding. But they also looked impressive, especially when interwoven with leather cords or colored thread. Imagine a warrior walking into battle with a beard braided in the shape of runes. Equal parts intimidation and art project. Some warriors also partially shaved their heads, leaving long hair or braids at the back, a dramatic look that may have roots in regional or tribal identities. It gave enemies something to remember if they survived the encounter. Hair care tools. Vikings didn't mess around. They had combs, razors, and tweezers, often carried in pouches or hung from belts. Some even had small mirrors made from polished metal. Because how else would you check if your braid game was still on point after sailing across the North Sea? Hair wasn't just a style. It was identity, honor, and sometimes even spiritual protection. Whether you were a shield maiden or a blacksmith, your hair told a story. And like any good saga, it was worth maintaining. You might think of Vikings as rugged and practical, and you'd be right. But practical didn't mean boring. These people loved their bling. Jewelry wasn't just decoration. It was currency, a status symbol, a family heirloom, and personal branding all in one. A well-dressed Viking didn't leave home without some glitter. Whether they were headed to a feast or a full-on raid, let's start with the classics. Brooches. Viking women especially relied on them, not just to hold their clothes together, but to show off wealth and craftsmanship. The famous oval brooches worn at the shoulders were often cast in bronze or silver and sometimes inlaid with intricate designs, serpents, knotwork, or even tiny animals. Between those brooches, beaded strands filled with glass, amber, or metal charms. Think of them as wearable LinkedIn profiles. Here's my wealth, my connections, and my craft. Let's network. For men, arm rings and neck tattoos were the go-to flex. Thick metal bands of silver or bronze, twisted and carved, are often worn with pride. These weren't just jewelry. They were currency. A chieftain might reward loyalty with a silver arm ring, and it could be broken into bits and weighed like coin. That's right. Viking bling doubled as emergency savings. Rings were common, too, worn on fingers or even toes. Some had inscriptions like short runic messages or blessings. Others were just for style. And yes, wedding rings existed. But like everything Viking, they tended to be chunky and symbolic rather than dainty or romantic. A marriage gift might include a ring, a brooch, or a finely made pin. You weren't just marrying into a family. You were showing that you had the assets to keep up. And let's not forget pendants. Thor's hammer was a favorite, worn as both a religious symbol and a lucky charm. It wasn't unusual to find hammers carved in silver hanging from cords of leather or woven fiber. Christian crosses started to appear, too, especially as more Norse folk converted. The Vikings weren't snobs. They'd wear both just in case one god was off duty. If you think makeup and skincare were strictly the domain of medieval queens and Persian poets, think again. Viking grooming extended far beyond just clean clothes and well-combed beards. These warriors, both men and women, dabbled in what we'd now call personal care, fragrance, and yes, even a bit of makeup. Let's start with the infamous kohl. Some accounts, especially from Arabic observers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe Viking men lining their eyes with a dark pigment. This wasn't just to look intimidating, though it certainly helped. Lining the eyes reduced glare from snow and sun, acting like a proto-sunglass for seafarers. Of course, it didn't hurt that it also made you look like a smoldering Norse god. Practical and fabulous. The Vikings said, "Yes, please." And while there's no Sephora in a longhouse situation going on, there's plenty of evidence that skincare and scents mattered. Animal fats mixed with herbs created balms to soften skin, soothe windburn, or protect against the chill. Birch tar, used mostly as an adhesive or antiseptic, could also be smeared onto skin to treat minor irritations or scare off pests with its strong scent. Speaking of scents, Vikings may not have had bottled cologne, but they understood the power of smell. They used herbs like thyme, mint, and sweet gale in their baths or clothing storage to add a pleasant aroma and ward off insects. Some wealthier individuals even had linen sachets filled with fragrant leaves tucked into their garments, basically the medieval version of a dryer sheet. Women likely applied oils to their hair and skin, not only for scent but also to create a healthy shine. In a society where beauty and cleanliness were tied to honor and household status, a glowing complexion wasn't just vanity. It was a reflection of discipline and domestic skill. And let's not forget the teeth. Viking skeletons show surprisingly good dental health for the time, though some had decorative grooves filed into their front teeth, possibly filled with pigment or resin. Whether this was fashion, tribal ID, or just early tattooing for your mouth, no one's quite sure. But it proves one thing. The Vikings were more than axe-swinging brutes. They were stylish. They were scented. And they absolutely had a skincare routine. Little Vikings didn't run around barefoot in sackcloth with tangled hay nests for hair. Not unless they wanted a stern look from mom and possibly a splash of icy fjord water to the face. Children in Viking society were expected to be clean, presentable, and dressed according to both their family's means and the cultural standards of the time. In other words, even the toddlers had style rules. Viking children typically wore miniature versions of adult clothing. Tunics for boys and long dresses for girls, often layered with cloaks or aprons depending on the weather. Wool and linen were the go-to materials, with soft leathers sometimes used for shoes or colder climates. And yes, those shoes were real footwear, not just scraps wrapped around feet. Even the youngest members of the household needed to be mobile. After all, you never knew when a goat would need chasing or a raid would roll through your village. Colors weren't limited to drab or neutral tones either. Viking children liked adult-sorted fabrics, bright reds, earthy yellows, and deep blues if the family could afford them. Embroidery was common, too, especially on festive or ceremonial garments. If your child was being presented at a thing or a family feast, you didn't send them in rags. You braided their hair, straightened their tunic, and hoped they wouldn't immediately fall in a puddle. Hair was neatly managed. Little girls often wore braids, sometimes adorned with small beads, while boys might sport short cuts or the early beginnings of the hairstyles their fathers wore. And hygiene taken seriously. Just like adults, children were expected to wash regularly, especially before meals or important events. Bath day was a family affair, and skipping it wasn't an option unless you wanted to be the stinky kid at the feast. Parents passed down grooming tools as heirlooms. A child's first comb might be a small carved bone version of their father's. It was symbolic. You are part of this culture now. Keep your beard tidy someday. In many ways, Viking children were raised to embody the same values as their parents. Dignity, discipline, and pride in appearance. Because even at 6 years old, you were already part of a story larger than yourself. And you better look the part. It's one thing to stay clean when you're near a cozy hearth and a tub of hot water. It's another when you're halfway across the sea, sleeping in a longship, raiding monasteries, and possibly dodging arrows. Yet somehow, Vikings managed to keep up their hygiene even on the road, or more accurately, on the fjord. Viking warriors didn't leave their grooming habits at home. Quite the opposite, they packed them. Archaeological finds from warrior graves have turned up grooming kits alongside weapons, tweezers, combs, razors, and ear picks. All tucked into leather pouches or hanging from belts. Because after all, what's the point of conquering a village if you look like you crawled out of a bog to do it? These tools weren't decorative. They were functional, durable, and part of a warrior's identity. A twisted, greasy beard might get in the way during battle. A clean-shaven neck made helmet straps more comfortable. And nobody wanted lice. Keeping the scalp clean and the beard neat was a matter of comfort, pride, and frankly, health. Viking razors were sharp, simple, and sometimes even curved, perfectly suited for shaving with a steady hand and a streamside reflection. Even clothing on the campaign was maintained. Vikings carried sewing needles and wax thread, patching holes and reinforcing seams. Looking put together wasn't about vanity. It was about utility. Torn garments got snagged in combat. Loose shoes made you slow, and wet wool was a recipe for hypothermia, so they mended, dried, and folded like warriors with a knack for domesticity. Water sources were essential during travel. Vikings often set up camp near rivers or springs, not just for drinking but for washing. Bathing might not be luxurious on the move, but a quick rinse with cold water beats nothing. And when possible, they heated water in pots and improvised bathing stations. Not quite a spa, but a far cry from the medieval grime most people imagine. And yes, even during raids, presentation mattered. Viking sagas often describe heroes washing their hands and combing their hair before battle or feasting. That wasn't just poetic. It was real. Whether you were about to swing a sword or steal a silver chalice, you did it with clean fingernails and a well-oiled beard. If you've been picturing Vikings as muddy, meat-sweating beasts with axes in one hand and fleas in their hair, it's time for a reality check. The myth of the filthy Norse brute, wide-eyed, dripping in blood and grime, was largely built by their enemies. And let's be honest, if you just got raided by a stylish, muscular seafarer who also smelled like juniper and mint, you want to make him look bad in the history books, too. The truth is, Vikings were some of the cleanest and best-groomed people in early medieval Europe. Compared to many Anglo-Saxons or Franks, who viewed bathing as suspicious at best and sinful at worst, the Norse obsession with hygiene made them look like walking contradictions. How could someone be both barbaric and better at skincare? Monks from Christian territories wrote about Norse hygiene with an odd mix of admiration and revulsion. They hated the fact that Viking men combed their hair, changed their shirts regularly, and took weekly baths. One monk even whined that Norse invaders were too successful with local women because they were always combing their hair, bathing every Saturday, and changing clothes often. Translation: they're hot and we hate it. Even today, popular media gets it wrong. Shows like Vikings or The Northmen do better than older portrayals, but still tend to overplay the grit. In reality, a Viking showing up to a feast in torn clothes and matted hair would be more likely to get side-eyed than celebrated. Status, honor, and reputation were everything, and that included how you looked and smelled. Did every Viking walk around looking like a runway model?
No.
Life was still rough, and survival came first. But the idea of cleanliness, order, and personal pride ran deep in their culture. A warrior's appearance was part of his strength. A woman's hair and dress reflected the honor of her household. Even in death, Vikings were buried with combs, razors, and grooming kits, because the afterlife deserved a polished version of you, too. In most of ancient Greece, a respectable woman was quiet, hidden, and obedient, basically invisible in public life. But walk into Sparta, and you'd find something radically different. Spartan women didn't just exist. They owned land, opinions, muscles, and, quite frankly, a lot of power. While Athenian women were locked away in domestic quarters, Spartan women were walking confidently through the agora, managing estates, and verbally sparring with men in public. No one told a Spartan woman to know her place. She already knew it, right next to power. From the moment a Spartan girl was born, she was raised to be strong, outspoken, and independent. Girls were given nearly the same physical training as boys, running, wrestling, and throwing javelins, not because they were expected to fight, but because strong mothers were believed to produce strong warriors. And Sparta needed warriors like crops need rain. Their entire society was built around warfare. And the next generation of soldiers had to come from hardy, disciplined mothers. Unlike their Athenian counterparts, Spartan women were educated. They could read, write, and most importantly, speak. Spartan women were known for their cutting wit and sharp tongues. Many quotes survive of them, delivering stone-cold one-liners to husbands, sons, and even kings. One mother, handing her son his shield, famously said, "Come back with it or on it." That wasn't metaphorical. That was the standard. Then there was the matter of property. In Sparta, women could inherit and own land, a radical concept in the ancient world. By some estimates, Spartan women controlled up to 1/3 of all property. When the men were off dying gloriously in wars, it was the women who ran the economy, managed households, and kept things moving. They didn't just have influence. They had agency. They chose when to marry. They negotiated dowries, and they weren't confined to silence. A Spartan woman could openly challenge a decision, especially when it affected her household or her sons. If you thought arranged marriages were cold and boring, you haven't met the Spartans. In their militarized world, even romance came with strategy and a touch of theatrical kidnapping. Spartan marriages didn't begin with candlelit dinners or swooning glances. They started with a ritual abduction. Yes, seriously. To get married in Sparta, the groom had to pretend to steal the bride. But don't let the word abduction fool you. This wasn't a crime. It was a performance steeped in symbolism and tradition.
Here's how it worked.
Once a marriage was arranged, typically by the families, often with political or economic interests in mind, the groom and his friends would sneak into the bride's household and abduct her. She was taken to a secret location where an older woman would shave her head, dress her in a man's cloak and sandals, and lay her down on a straw pallet. Now, why the androgynous makeover? That's still debated, but it likely had to do with Sparta's rigid gender expectations. The bride had to be symbolically unsexed, perhaps as a way to mark the transition from girlhood to womanhood, or to reflect the masculinity that Spartan society prized. Shaving her head was also a way to tie the ritual to the military identity of the place. After all, femininity was fine, but toughness was mandatory. The groom would then visit her in secret under the cover of night, sometimes for months. By day, he stayed in his barracks with the other men, following strict military routines. By night, he'd sneak away for these trysts with his wife. It was both romantic and incredibly awkward, a clandestine honeymoon that could last well into the first year of marriage. This strange custom reflected the balancing act Spartan society demanded. Warrior discipline above all, but reproduction was a duty to the state. Men weren't allowed to move in with their wives until they were 30. And even then, military obligations came first. So, you've been ritually abducted. Your hair's been shaved. You're officially married. Congratulations. Now, pack your things and go back to your parents' house. Because in Sparta, being married didn't mean moving in together. In fact, one of the strangest aspects of Spartan marriage was how long couples spent living apart, sometimes years. Spartan men were expected to live in military barracks until they were 30. This wasn't optional. From the age of 7, boys entered the egg, the state-run education and training system that forged them into warriors. Even after reaching adulthood, they remained part of communal mess groups, Sakia, and were expected to spend their nights in the company of their fellow soldiers, not their wives. Domestic life was secondary to duty. For newlywed men, this meant that marriage was more like a recurring secret rendezvous than a shared household. A husband would sneak away at night to be with his wife, then return to the barracks before sunrise. These nightly visits could go on for years until the man was finally permitted to live at home. The idea wasn't to deprive them of intimacy. It was to ensure that family life never distracted from military discipline. As for the women, they remained at home, managing property, raising children, and maintaining the household. But don't imagine them pining by the hearth. Spartan women were famously independent and economically powerful. With their husbands away, they ran estates, supervised helot laborers, and took part in civic life. Some even grew wealthy, controlling land, influencing local politics, and commanding respect in ways unthinkable in other parts of Greece. This odd arrangement didn't stop Spartans from having children. In fact, producing strong offspring was a civic duty. Some sources suggest that if a man was deemed too weak, another stronger man could be invited to father children with his wife, all with the state's blessing. The goal was not romance or personal fulfillment. It was the survival and supremacy of Sparta. In Sparta, motherhood was not a gentle affair. It was a civic mission. Spartan women weren't praised for embroidery or piety. They were celebrated for producing strong sons who could serve the state. Giving birth wasn't just personal. It was patriotic. Every child was a future warrior or the mother of one. And the stakes were sky-high. From a young age, girls were trained for this role. Not just in the household arts, but physically. Running, wrestling, and discus throwing. All these exercises weren't just for sport. They were meant to ensure healthy, capable mothers who could bear robust children. A weak mother, the Spartans believed, would bear weak soldiers. And Sparta had no room for that. When a Spartan woman gave birth, her child was immediately examined by the state. If the newborn appeared frail or deformed, it could be abandoned, left at the foot of Mount Teotl, exposed to the elements. As brutal as this sounds, it reflected the Spartan obsession with strength and survival. There was no tolerance for perceived weakness. Only the strong would be raised, trained, and eventually contribute to the warrior machine. But for women who did produce healthy sons, status was elevated. Spartan mothers held immense influence, not through politics, but through legacy. A woman who had lost multiple sons in battle might receive public honors. She wasn't pied. She was revered. Her sacrifice was seen as noble, almost sacred. Mothers would tell their sons to return with your shield or on it, meaning come back victorious or die trying. Interestingly, women were not just baby factories. They had a say in their children's upbringing, particularly before the boys were handed over to the Aeog at age 7. Until then, mothers shaped their values, pride, endurance, and discipline. Girls, meanwhile, stayed with their mothers and were molded into the next generation of Spartan women, strong, smart, and unafraid to speak their minds. Lineage also mattered. Noble Spartan women came from the warrior elite, and their family connections could impact marriage prospects and land inheritance. But regardless of class, a mother's greatest pride and the ultimate mark of honor was in raising a child who could serve the state. While women across much of the ancient world were treated like property, Spartan women owned property, and lots of it. In fact, by some estimates, they controlled nearly a third of all land in Sparta. That wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a seismic shift in gender norms. In a society where men were constantly away training or fighting, women stepped into the economic driver's seat and never gave it back. This wasn't some accidental loophole. Spartan law allowed women to inherit property from both their fathers and their husbands. And since so many Spartan men died young in battle, widows were common and often quite wealthy. But these women weren't just passive landholders. They actively managed estates, directed laborers, mainly helots, and negotiated business dealings. They were landowners, estate managers, and economic power brokers all rolled into one. This made Spartan women extraordinarily influential. They had wealth, they had authority, and they had autonomy. They didn't need male guardians to represent them in court or public dealings like Athenian women did. A Spartan woman could act in her own name, a rare privilege in the ancient world. But with all that power came suspicion, especially from outside observers. Non-Spartan writers like Aristotle complained bitterly about how much control Spartan women had. He blamed them for the decline of Sparta, calling them unruly, indulgent, and too influential for their own good. In truth, he was probably just deeply uncomfortable with the idea of women being more economically independent than the average Athenian male. Within Sparta, however, this arrangement made sense. Men were warriors. They lived and died for the state. If they were to be absent from home for most of their lives, someone had to keep the economy running. That someone was the Spartan woman. It wasn't feminism. It was functional. But the result was the same. Women who were educated, empowered, and economically self-sufficient. They didn't just marry warriors. They bankrolled them. In a culture so obsessed with discipline and warfare, you'd think beauty and fashion would be afterthoughts. But Spartan women weren't just strong. They were striking. And unlike their Athenian counterparts, they didn't hide behind veils or stay cloistered indoors. Spartan women walked boldly in public, unashamed of their bodies, their opinions, or their presence. In Sparta, beauty wasn't about softness. It was about strength, health, and pride. Spartan standards of beauty were unique. Pale skin and frailty, the hallmarks of aristocratic women in other Greek cities, were not desirable here. A tan meant you trained outdoors. Muscles meant you could run, wrestle, and bear strong children. Spartan women were admired not just for their looks, but for the power those looks represented. They didn't strive for delicacy. They radiated vitality. Their clothing reflected this attitude. While women in Athens were wrapped in layers of fabric that kept them modest and immobile, Spartan women wore the pepo, a simpler, more functional garment. But Spartan people were often shorter, even slid up the side, allowing for freedom of movement. This shocked the rest of Greece. To them, Spartan women seemed scandalously underdressed. But to Spartans, this practicality was just common sense. Hair was typically worn long and loose, symbolizing freedom and maturity. There's no evidence of elaborate cosmetics routines. Spartan women weren't painting their faces to please men. Beauty came from fitness, cleanliness, and confidence. It was a physical extension of their inner discipline, and they weren't confined to the shadows. Spartan women could be seen at festivals, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies. They sang in choruses, danced in public, and even competed in their own games. This visibility was unheard of elsewhere in Greece. In Athens, a woman's honor was tied to how rarely she was seen or heard. In Sparta, a woman's reputation began with her public voice. This open presence unnerved many Greek observers. They saw boldness where Sparta saw virtue. They saw shamelessness where Sparta saw pride. But the truth was simple. Spartan women weren't ornamental. They were active citizens commanding attention not through makeup or jewelry, but through presence, strength, and the unapologetic confidence of someone raised to be seen. If you imagine ancient women as quiet, submissive, and sweetly spoken, Spartan women will shatter that fantasy with a single cutting remark. These women were not only educated, but they were also famously outspoken. In a world where most women were silenced by custom or law, Spartan women were encouraged to speak their minds. And when they spoke, they didn't whisper, they roared. Unlike Athenian girls, who were usually uneducated and confined to the home, Spartan girls were schooled in both mind and body. Literacy was common. They learned poetry, music, dance, and perhaps most importantly, the art of speech. In a society where verbal sparring was nearly as respected as physical combat, Spartan women held their own and often delivered the final blow. Historical sources are filled with quotes attributed to Spartan women that still hit like verbal daggers. When a mother was told her son had died bravely in battle, she replied, "I bore him for that very purpose." Another, upon learning her son had allegedly fled, said, "Why do you still live?" Brutal. Absolutely. But these weren't heartless women. They were simply steeped in a culture where loyalty to the state outweighed personal emotion. Their sharp wit wasn't just reserved for their children. Spartan women routinely mocked cowardice in men, even their own husbands, and praised valor. A woman might lose all social respect if her son or husband showed weakness. Conversely, if they died gloriously, she was honored, almost sacred. In Sparta, strength of character and tongue was a feminine virtue. This reputation spread far beyond Laconia. Greek writers from other city-states often commented on the unfeminine nature of Spartan women, their bold voices, their public presence, and their refusal to be subdued. But Sparta didn't care about Athenian opinions. It cared about results and a woman who could command attention, raise warriors, and speak like a general. That was a woman to be respected. Even in myth and memory, Spartan women stand out not for passivity, but for presence. They weren't just mothers and wives. They were mentors, guardians of discipline, and verbal gladiators. In a city built on strength, silence wasn't golden. It was suspicious. And a Spartan woman with a sharp tongue, that was just another weapon in the arsenal. In most of ancient Greece, marital fidelity was a one-way street. Men could stray, women could not. But in Sparta, even sexual politics were unconventional. Spartan marriage didn't revolve around romantic love or monogamy. It was about biology, duty, and ensuring a steady stream of future warriors, and sometimes that meant bending or outright breaking the typical rules of fidelity. Spartan society was deeply pragmatic. The state's survival depended on a strong army, and a strong army required strong children. So if a husband was too old, too weak, or too frequently away on campaign, it wasn't unthinkable for a Spartan wife to be paired temporarily or semi-officially with another man purely for reproductive purposes. This wasn't scandalous. It was statecraft. There are accounts of older men lending their wives to younger, fitter men to produce healthy offspring. Sometimes permission was given. Sometimes it was arranged quietly. And if a woman herself identified as strong, reputable Spartan and wanted to bear his children, she could with her husband's blessing. The key factor wasn't jealousy or morality. It was strength, lineage, and civic benefit. This has led to debates about whether Sparta practiced polyandry, one woman having multiple husbands, especially since male citizens were often away for years. While it wasn't official policy, practical arrangements like shared wives or fathering agreements did exist. But it's important to note this wasn't about love triangles or free love. It was about breeding the best soldiers possible. And children born of these unions were fully legitimate, provided both parties were citizens. The state wasn't concerned with whose name went on a birth record. It cared about the quality of the next hoplite. Of course, this reproductive flexibility wasn't available to everyone. It was limited to full Spartan citizens, the elite Spartiates, whose declining numbers made each birth a matter of national interest. The helots and lower classes weren't afforded the same agency or choices. Still, this unique approach gave Spartan women a level of sexual autonomy unseen elsewhere in the Greek world. While Athenian women were cloistered to preserve their chastity, Spartan women were trusted, even expected, to make decisions about reproduction that aligned with the state's needs. In Sparta, your love life wasn't just personal, it was political. And babies. They weren't just blessings. They were strategic assets. Long after Sparta fell, the legend of the Spartan woman lived on. Fierce, independent, and unlike any other woman in the ancient world. While Athenian playwrights and Roman historians often reduced her to a curiosity or a warning, her legacy was much bigger than scandal or stereotype. She embodied a rare combination of discipline, authority, and respect. and for that she is echoed through time like a spear striking bronze. In her own era, the Spartan woman was a walking contradiction. She was a landowner in a patriarchal world, a public speaker in a society that silenced women, and a figure of beauty whose body was admired for strength rather than softness. She didn't hide behind a veil or await instruction. She instructed. She ran estates, raised warriors, made cutting political observations, and even directed reproductive decisions, all while operating within one of the most rigidly militarized societies ever known. She was no feminist in the modern sense. Her freedoms were granted by a brutal system built around male warfare, but within those constraints, she achieved a level of autonomy that other Greek women could only dream of. And she did it without apology. Her influence wasn't confined to her lifetime. Philosophers like Aristotle criticized her. Roman writers couldn't stop talking about her boldness. Even modern historians are captivated by her paradox. Empowered, yet born into a system that prioritized the state over the self. And yet, that's what makes her so compelling. The Spartan woman was never just a side character in her husband's story. She was the foundation of Spartan society, the one who kept the economy running, the households intact, and the warrior supply steady. She was the unsung strategist behind the spear wielders, the shield that didn't crack. In many ways, she challenges every assumption about gender in the ancient world. While most women were denied agency, the Spartan woman embodied it. And while her freedoms were carved from necessity, they became cultural cornerstones, respected, institutionalized, and even feared. Today, she remains a symbol of contradiction and defiance. Not because she rejected her society's values, but because she mastered them. In a world of men, she didn't just survive. She thrived with a blade-sharp mind, a well-run estate, and a tongue that could wound deeper than any sword. In Sparta, death wasn't a tragedy. It was a test, a final measure of whether a person had lived in service to the state. Unlike the lavish funerary customs of Athens or Egypt, Spartan death rites were stripped bare of emotion and ornament. No long public mourning, no ornate grave markers for the masses. In fact, most Spartans were buried anonymously. A nameless grave wasn't shameful. It was expected that only two types of people would be given the honor of having their names carved in stone: warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth. Everyone else, no matter how respected in life, was buried quietly without commemoration.
Why?
Because in the eyes of Sparta, the ultimate sacrifice wasn't living well. It was dying for the state. For men, that meant death on the battlefield. Not from illness, not in old age, and definitely not in bed. A warrior who died clutching his shield in formation was a hero. A man who died from slipping in the bath. Forgotten. Spartans believed that falling in battle was the only noble end, the culmination of a life shaped by the brutal agoge training and years of military service. It was an honorable discharge with no return ticket. For women, it was a different battlefield, the birthing room. If a woman died giving birth, she was seen as having fulfilled her highest duty, producing the next generation of warriors. Like the male soldier, she had faced pain and risk for the sake of Sparta's survival. Her death too merited a grave marked by name. Everyone else, the merchants, elders, craftspeople, and even those who died peacefully after a long life, received a modest burial and were left unmarked. Their service was appreciated, but not glorified. The logic was brutal but consistent. Sparta honored sacrifice, not sentiment. Mourning was kept brief, just a few days, and loud lamentation was discouraged. The focus wasn't on sorrow, but on legacy. How did the person die? What did their death contribute to Sparta? In this harsh system, dying well wasn't about comfort. It was about proving your worth one last time in the most final and public way possible. In Sparta, dying as a warrior wasn't just heroic. It was the ideal. From the moment a boy entered the Aegean at age 7, he was trained for one singular purpose: to die gloriously, if needed, in defense of the state. And not just any kind of death would do. A warrior's death had to be public, brutal, and above all, in battle. Only then did it earn recognition. The Spartan shield wasn't just equipment. It was symbolic. To lose it in combat was the ultimate disgrace. A hoplite who dropped his sword might be forgiven. But abandon your shield, and you'd likely be banished or killed.
Why?
Because the shield protected not just the soldier, but the entire phalanx. Without it, you endanger everyone else. That's why Spartan mothers famously told their sons, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning victorious or dead. Anything else was cowardice. If a Spartan died with honor, holding the line, refusing retreat, his name was remembered. His grave was marked. His family was praised. The city itself would publicly honor him because he had become the very image of Spartan virtue, strength, courage, and loyalty to the end. And yet for all this glory, Spartan funerals remained minimalist. No carved sculptures, no epic poems, no parades of mourners. A simple marked grave, possibly with a name and a symbol of their rank, was enough. The legacy didn't need art. It lived in memory and reputation. What made the warrior's death so sacred wasn't personal achievement. It was a sacrifice. Sparta cared little for individual glory. A man who fought well and lived was useful. A man who fought well and died was immortalized not for his skills, but for his service. Even in myth, Spartans honored this principle. Leonidas and his 300 weren't idolized because they won. They didn't. They were remembered because they stood and died when others would have run. That was Sparta's idea of success. Total loyalty, even unto death. So while other cities built marble tombs for poets and politicians, Sparta honored its dead soldiers with silence, brevity, and the quiet power of a name chiseled in stone. In a society built around war, it might seem like women were pushed to the margins. But Spartan women played a vital, if often understated, role. Their duty wasn't to fight on the battlefield, but to give birth to those who would. And in Sparta, this responsibility was taken so seriously that a woman who died in childbirth earned the same honor as a warrior who died in combat, a marked grave. This was no small gesture. Most Spartan citizens, regardless of status, were buried anonymously. Only those who made the ultimate sacrifice for the state were remembered by name. For a woman, that meant enduring the physical trial of labor, a task Sparta treated as her own form of battle. To die in childbirth was to give everything for the state's future. And Sparta, brutal as it was, recognized that sacrifice. There was no grand ceremony, no mournful procession, but her name would be carved into stone, a rare act in a society that valued silence and self-control over spectacle. That stone wasn't just a grave marker. It was an official acknowledgement. This woman died in service to Sparta. Spartan girls were trained from youth to be physically strong and resilient. This wasn't just to make them tough. It was to prepare them for motherhood. A healthy, disciplined body was believed to produce strong sons and, by extension, a stronger state. The logic was harsh, but consistent with the militarized values that defined every inch of Spartan life. A woman's worth wasn't measured by beauty or obedience, as it was in Athens or Corinth. In Sparta, her worth was tied to legacy, the sons she bore, the household she managed, the land she owned, and in rare cases, the ultimate price she paid giving life to Sparta's next generation. This idea of childbirth as a battle made Spartan women both respected and feared by outsiders. To many Greeks, Spartan women were wild, unfeminine, and overly bold. But within their own walls, they were pillars of strength and, when necessary, martyrs. So when a Spartan woman died in childbirth, her name wasn't just remembered, it was revered. Because in a land of warriors, she had proven herself one in the only way she was allowed. In Sparta, death wasn't a time for spectacle. It was a time for silence. Unlike Athens, where funerals could turn into dramatic public performances with mourners tearing their clothes and professional wailers sobbing on cue, Sparta kept its funerals short, serious, and subdued. Mourning wasn't forbidden, but it was regulated. Spartan restraint didn't stop with life. It extended deep into death. The funeral of a Spartan was quick. Burial usually happened within 24 hours of death. No long wakes, no drawn-out lamentations. Excessive displays of emotion were discouraged, especially in public. Crying loudly, wailing, or throwing oneself on the coffin was frowned upon. Not because Spartans didn't feel grief, but because grief was considered personal and public discipline always came first. There was no elaborate processional. The body, if male, might be wrapped in a cloak and carried on a shield by his comrades. If female, she may have been wrapped simply and laid to rest without jewelry or finery. Wealth and decoration didn't matter. The legacy of the life did. Burials typically took place outside the city walls in designated graveyards. While most graves were unmarked, those who had earned the honor, fallen warriors and women who died in childbirth, might receive a stone marker with a name. No fixed epitaph, just a name, sometimes a symbol. That was all. In Sparta, that was enough. Family mourning was modest, restricted to a few days. Laws even limited how many people could attend a funeral and who was allowed to wear black or shave their heads in mourning. The message was clear. Don't mourn too long. Life and duty must go on. Cremation wasn't commonly practiced in Sparta. Burial was preferred, with the body returned to the earth quickly and without ceremony. There were no grand tombs, no pyramids of pride. The glory was not in where or how you were buried, but why. Even children were taught to approach death with stoicism. If your father died in battle, you didn't collapse in grief. You stood taller. If your mother died in childbirth, you didn't weep. You honored her memory by living up to her sacrifice. In Sparta, the funeral wasn't the end of the story. It was just a brief pause before the legacy began. To die as a Spartan wasn't just about the moment you fell. It was about how you were carried afterward. In a culture that revered sacrifice over sentiment, two objects stood at the heart of Spartanary symbolism: the shield and the burial shroud. Simple, powerful, unmistakable. The shield wasn't just battlefield equipment. It was a deeply personal item. The one piece of armor a Spartan was never allowed to lose. Unlike swords or spears, which could be replaced or dropped in battle, the shield protected not just the warrior, but the man standing next to him. It represented discipline, unity, and courage. To abandon it was to betray your comrades. That's why Spartans said, "with your shield or on it." It was both a battle cry and a burial instruction. When a Spartan warrior fell in battle, he was often carried home on his shield. That flat surface, now silent and bloodied, became his final bed. It was a public statement. This man did not run. This man died with honor. It was the ultimate sign that he had passed Sparta's final test. For women, the shroud was just as symbolic. Unlike the warrior's shield, the burial shroud was not public or martial. It was private, domestic. The woman who died in childbirth might be wrapped in the very cloths she had woven herself. These shrouds weren't fancy. They weren't perfumed or jeweled. But they were sacred, proof that she had completed her duty, given life to Sparta, and paid the ultimate price. No gold, no weapons, no grave goods. Spartan funerals avoided the materialistic trappings common in other parts of Greece. Even the shroud and shield were functional, not decorative. But in Spartan eyes, they said everything that needed saying. These symbols, one hard and forged in war, the other soft and spun in the home, told you exactly who the deceased had been. You didn't need a eulogy. You didn't need a statue. A man carried on his shield, or a woman wrapped in her woven cloth. These were Sparta's true memorials. In most cultures, mourning is loud, emotional, and drawn out, a release of sorrow for the living and a tribute to the dead. But Sparta wasn't most cultures. In Sparta, mourning wasn't about emotion.
It was about control.
The death of a loved one was not an invitation to weep. It was a test. Just like every other moment in Spartan life, grief in Sparta was a private affair, strictly regulated by law and custom. Loud wailing, forbidden. Tearing your clothes, excessive. Falling to your knees in public despair? Absolutely not. Spartans believed that public grief weakened morale and disrupted the collective focus on duty. And so, even in death, personal feelings bowed to the state. Mourning periods were short, typically only a few days. Families were expected to return to daily life quickly. No prolonged black clothing, no monthly rituals, no shrines in the home. The dead had passed into memory, and memory had to serve Sparta, not sentiment. Children were raised with this mentality from a young age. If your father died in battle, you didn't cry. You honored him by standing tall. If your mother died in childbirth, you didn't crumble. You carried on her strength. Spartan boys were even encouraged to show no emotion at funerals as an early exercise in stoicism. A tear could be seen as weakness. This doesn't mean Spartans didn't feel loss. Of course, they did. But feelings were never meant to get in the way of function. A Spartan mother might mourn her son quietly, but if he died with honor, she would feel pride above pain. In some cases, women whose sons survived battle were less celebrated than those whose sons had died bravely. The values were inverted. Grief became glory. Memory in this context was less about personal remembrance and more about civic contribution. The name on a grave wasn't just for the family. It was for Sparta. It told future generations. This person gave everything. Learn from them. Emulate them. In Sparta, death could make you a hero, but only if it happened the right way. Dying in battle was honorable. Dying for Sparta was divine. But dying in cowardice, that was worse than death itself. In a culture that worshipped bravery, there was no space for hesitation. A Spartan who fled the battlefield wasn't just shamed. He was erased, disgraced, and damned by memory. The word for this kind of man was trembler, someone who shook with fear instead of standing firm in combat. Tremblers were publicly humiliated. They were forced to wear cloaks with patches of different colors to mark their disgrace. Their beards were half-shaved, a visual announcement that they had failed to uphold their duty. And their shame was communal. They couldn't marry, they couldn't hold office, and they couldn't sit beside honorable men in public events. They were ghosts in their own city. And if they died after having fled, there was no redemption, no name on a stone, no recognition, not even anonymous burial with the rest. The city might bury the body, but it wouldn't mourn. The man would be remembered, if at all, as a warning, not a warrior. It's worth noting that Spartans didn't demand suicidal charges or foolish bravery. Strategic retreat in the name of a larger tactical goal was one thing, but abandoning your comrades to save your own skin, that was the ultimate betrayal. This same strict moral code applied even within the family. A mother might disown a son who came back alive but dishonored. Some mothers are even recorded as having opened their doors only to slam them shut in the face of a living but cowardly child. A brutal gesture, yes, but in Sparta, Honor was not negotiable. Cowardice didn't just stain the individual. It stained the bloodline. A cowardly death meant your family name was associated with weakness. The death sentence for reputation in a society where legacy was everything. In Sparta, where the individual often took a backseat to the collective, burial sites reflected the city's austere and disciplined values. Unlike the grand tombs of Athens or the elaborate necropolises of Egypt, Spartan graves were intentionally simple, a stark reminder that in death, as in life, humility and service were paramount. Most Spartans were buried outside the city walls and communal graveyards. These sites were functional, not decorative. Graves were unmarked pits or shallow earth mounds, often without any lasting memorial. The lack of personal monuments underscored a cultural emphasis on the collective over the individual. The city remembered its heroes, but it did so without fanfare. Only those who died in battle or women who died in childbirth received marked graves. These exceptions were rare and significant. Their graves might have simple stone markers inscribed with names or symbols serving as public recognition of sacrifice. These markers weren't ostentatious, with no statues or elaborate carvings, just a name to remind future generations of the individual's contribution to the police. Some historians suggest that Spartan burial practices were designed to avoid glorifying death itself. Unlike other cultures that celebrated the afterlife with lavish tombs, Sparta saw death as a transition. The real honor was in the life led, not the monument left behind. The Spartan dead were not worshipped, but remembered through actions and stories passed down by the living. These burial sites also served a social function. They reminded Spartans daily of the cost of their militarized society. Every grave was a silent testament to the sacrifices made for the city's survival and supremacy. Visiting these sites wasn't a moment for grief, but for reflection on duty and legacy. Moreover, the communal nature of Spartan graves reinforced the city's ideology. In life, Spartans fought as a unified phalanx. In death, they rested together in shared earth, equal before the state. No single Spartan was greater than the whole, and burial customs reflected that profound humility. The Spartan approach to burial, though stark, spoke volumes. It was a final lesson. Glory is fleeting, but service is eternal. In Sparta, the way you were remembered mattered far more than how long or loudly you were mourned. Unlike many ancient cultures that celebrated elaborate funerals and erected grand monuments, Spartan society focused on legacy, the lasting impact of a person's life and death, not the ceremony surrounding it. Spartans believed that excessive mourning was a sign of weakness, both personal and collective. Their society thrived on discipline and endurance, so lingering grief was discouraged. Instead, the community honored the dead through memory, stories, and actions that reflected the values of courage and sacrifice. For fallen warriors, remembrance was tied closely to their deeds on the battlefield. Songs, poems, and oral histories celebrated those who died bravely defending Sparta. Their names were spoken with pride, not just by their families, but by the entire city. Even without elaborate tombs, their legacies were immortalized in Spartan culture, a living tribute to their sacrifice. Women who died in childbirth also received lasting recognition. Their deaths were seen as equally vital to Sparta's future, and their names were remembered as symbols of strength and duty. In this way, Spartan women were honored as integral to the city's survival, not merely as passive figures. The Spartan ethos extended beyond individual families. Memorials and public commemorations were less about personal loss and more about reinforcing collective identity. Annual festivals and rituals often included honoring the dead as exemplars of Spartan virtue, inspiring the living to embody the same courage and discipline. This focus on legacy also shaped Spartan education. Boys were taught to see death not as an end, but as a passage into immortal honor. They learned that dying well secured their place in the community's memory, a powerful motivator that tied personal conduct to public duty. The Spartan approach may seem harsh by modern standards, but it forged a resilient society where death was neither feared nor excessively lamented. Mourning was brief, but remembrance was enduring. Thanks for being with us.